Boy, that brings back memories, doesn't it? How many of you grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or showed it to your children? I was born at just the right time. I was 4 when it first appeared on our local PBS station. And paired with Sesame Street, which came out at the same time, this little white girl from the country in Saratoga County, or southern Rensselaer County, where I grew up, was suddenly learning about towns and cities. I was counting and spelling in both English and Spanish. I learned what other people looked like, what it meant to use our imagination, and what it meant to be a neighbor. I was reminded of this powerful ministry from this gentle Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh that he conducted for decades when I watched the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, last summer. It struck me how important it was to hear those messages at that time in the wake of the King assassination, in the midst of the Vietnam War, in the restlessness of the country, something a little kid from the country knew nothing about, except that these things seemed wrong and some of my schoolmates' dads didn't come home. I don't think it's a mistake that this documentary and the upcoming film about Fred Rogers starring Tom Hanks is resonating so deeply right now. The lessons that Mr. Rogers was teaching us and is still teaching us help ground us when we feel utterly ungrounded. They are there for the taking, reminders of what Unitarian minister Robert Fulgham reminded us that we learned in kindergarten: how to be kind, how to share, how to forgive, and how to take care of ourselves and each other. We need these reminders. Too often we get caught up in the hustle and bustle of life, and lately the anxieties too. And we forget to pay attention to others. We forget that while we are the lead characters in our own stories, we're just bit players and maybe background extras in the stories of other people's lives. Right? I mean, so many times it seems other people try to upstage us with their ideas, opinions, criticisms, dramas, or worse, we upstage them if we're more important or valued, or so we think. And so it's no wonder that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood continues to be so important. And of course, now the animated show, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. The ministry of Fred Rogers focused on teaching children and us how to live out the assertion that we have inherent worth and dignity just by being human, and how to treat ourselves and each other. And so, while I don't know this for a fact, I suspect that the grounding for some of these lessons come from the letters from Paul in the Christian scriptures. And in particular, a passage, an often difficult passage from the letter to the Ephesians. Now, I say difficult because the writer uses the metaphor of marriage to explain his point. And here's where that pesky wives be subject to your husbands thing crops up. Yeah, I know. But what the whole section is getting at, and what the writer states at the beginning and the end, is simply this: be subject to one another. Now, for those not familiar with the biblical text, this epistle or letter to the church in Ephesus on the Mediterranean is one of many written in the name of Paul of Tarsus, someone who was spreading Jesus' ministry and spreading this word. Now, Paul was kind of like, I don't know, like one of our regional consultants, right? Like, he's planting churches, but he's traveling around and he's keeping tabs on what's happening all over. And well, let's not kid ourselves. People 2,000 years ago were very much like people today. And any time you get a bunch of people organized, there's going to be trouble. Especially when they're organized around a mission or a vision or a belief. So anyway, these letters aren't, well, to me anyway, so much sacred text as swift kicks in the collective keisters. See, over and over again, Paul and his people who are writing in his name are telling folks to stop bending the stories of Jesus to make you look good and really just stop being bad. I mean, this one to the Ephesians is no different. My hunch is there was a lot of conflict and infighting there, so this letter is very much reminding everyone to get along with one another, especially since the figure that they're centering their organization around, Jesus, is most assuredly not keen on people treating each other with disrespect. So in other words, this section, this whole idea is not about a particular belief or connection to a particular God, but it's about you and it's about me, which means it's about us. What we're talking about is seeing one another as family, as the people we devote our last measure of affection to. It's how we understand being seen and cared for and thought of. This idea is calling us back to our best selves. It's about how we treat one another, the people we have known for weeks or months or years or decades, the people we work side by side with on committees and events and projects, the people we celebrate with and mourn with, the people who delight us and annoy us, but whom we know will always be there. The people who we see, care for, and think of and hope are seen by, cared for by, and thought of by. Now, look, I know people don't always get along well all the time, especially when you do have decades of history. When I first started serving our congregation in Southold on Long Island, I had a series of meetings with members so I could learn more about the congregation and the people. And one afternoon, I was to meet with a woman I'll call Dorothy, who had been a member for, about 40 years. And then later that day with a woman named Caroline, who'd been a member for about 40 years. Both women had served as president, as stewardship chairs, on various other committees. They both taught religious education. Their kids had gone through the program. I mean, these are people who had done it all. In my conversation with Dorothy, I learned about the 7-year period where she and Caroline didn't talk to one another because Caroline had done something so terrible, but over time they kind of forgot about it and, well, had to work together. And, they argue, but they're talking again. A few hours later, I learned from Caroline how she and Dorothy hadn't talked for about 7 years because Dorothy had done something so horrible and terrible. And, well, at some point they started forgetting about it. And, yeah, they still argue, but, yeah, they work together and they're talking again. So my point is that many of you have similar stories. We sometimes speak without thinking because, well, these people know me and I can say anything around them and it doesn't matter. But it does. And the way we treat one another and speak to each other can cause long-held grudges and hard rifts if we're not careful. We assume there's a level of trust, forgetting that trust needs to be constantly built and tended. I wonder if Caroline and Dorothy could have avoided the 7 years of silence if they thought about how they were seeing one another, speaking to one another, and being subject to one another. Maybe they realize what had happened and make an effort to call one another back into covenant. I wonder what happens when we do. You see, this stuff matters, because if we don't get it right inside our walls, we have no hope of getting it right in the world. Because being subject to one another is about family and friends and fellow congregants, of course, but it's also about strangers, people in the workplace, folks we run into at the coffee shop, on the thruway, at the airport, in our gyms, in houses of worship. This is how we treat one another with our policies and our laws. This is how we affirm justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. All right, so let me be clear after I take a sip. Being subject to one another is not about being subservient. as some might want to interpret this Ephesians text. This is not about imbalance of power, or at least it shouldn't be, right? It's about attention, being attentive to one another. We might see it as being kind. Now, let me make a distinction here. I do not mean nice. I hate that word, nice. Nice is wishy-washy. Nice rolls over. Nice buys into the gospel of comfort that says we don't want to offend. Nice doesn't make waves or make us think and lets people have their own version of the truth. Nice doesn't want to bother anyone. Nice says comfort is more important than goodness, ease more value than doing what's right. We are, however, supposed to be kind. Kindness sees a need and offers to help. Kindness stands up for the person being bullied and makes sure they're safe. Kindness disrupts lawlessness and incivility. Kindness goes out of its way. Kindness recycles. Kindness holds the door. Kindness builds a ramp. Kindness explains. Kindness knows its privilege and uses it to build justice. And that's just the start, because kindness is not easy. Kindness can be uncomfortable because it requires us to not stay comfortable, not to stay nice. And kindness doesn't stay still. Kindness acts in big and small ways. Kindness calls elected representatives and writes letters and votes and makes sure other people can get to vote too, and goes to protest marches and makes sure everyone who wants a voice has one. Kindness wants people to work and have value in their work. Kindness believes the survivors. Kindness prays for the protection of sacred land and water and asks forgiveness. Kindness knows that trans people can't be erased. Kindness presses legislators to send aid to Puerto Rico and other places in need. Kindness works for racial justice because it knows that Black Lives Matter. Kindness answers yes. Kindness doesn't calculate the return on investment or the risk to reputation or the fear of comments. Kindness is present to the moment. It isn't easy, but it matters. Kindness doesn't assume everyone knows how we do things here. Kindness welcomes new ideas as a gift, not a challenge. Kindness embraces complexity. Kindness embraces discomfort in service to something better. Kindness prefers efficiency, or effectiveness over efficiency. Kindness creates physical and organizational structures that create better spaces for everyone. Kindness apologizes, really apologizes, and takes responsibility. Kindness lets go of perfectionism. Kindness speaks honestly, but also speaks with great thoughtfulness and care. I mean, imagine if we were thoughtful about how we communicate with one another. There's this great meme that uses the acronym THINK to help us think about our communication. So first, T, is it thoughtful? Meaning, did we actually think before we spoke? H, is it helpful? Meaning, does what you are about to say actually offer advice or information or just criticism? I, is it inspiring? Does it give a boost or does it shame? N, is it needed? Meaning simply that. Does it need to be said? Or would it just make you feel better? And is it kind? Well, we've certainly been talking about kind. And I think that's the key. Kindness is how we live into covenant with one another. How we act as Fred Rogers taught us to act. How the writer of Ephesians taught us to act. You see, there's a reason the writer of Ephesians uses marriage as a metaphor for being subject to one another. He's not just talking about affection for others, but understanding that when all is said and done, we're all a part of one family or one body. How can we be unkind to one part of our body when it's so intrinsically part of us? It's an amazing gospel piece by Hezekiah Walker. I need you, you need me. We're all a part of God's body. Stand with me, agree with me. We're all a part of God's body. It is God's will that every need be supplied. You are important to me. I need you to survive. I get a little choked. Imagine if we think of another person this way. To show them that they matter, that we see them as individuals and listen to their stories and consider their needs. Imagine if we thought of ourselves this way and were actually kind to ourselves. Because when we start acting that way to ourselves and then each other, we begin to see how we are subject to one another, even if other people are the ones disagreeing with us at the top of their voices. We are subject to one another when we stop building walls and start building bridges. We are subject to one another when we marry our values to our resources. We are subject to one another when we work for equal rights and equal pay and safety and clean water and accessibility for everyone. We're subject to one another when we join our forces together, remembering Margaret Mead's words, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Be subject to one another, pleads the writer of Ephesians, and Mr. Rogers, and every religious path worth its salt, and our commitment to covenant as Unitarian Universalists, which is a promise to be subject to one another, to be kind to one another, to forgive one another. We know this stuff. We learned it as children. It's what drew us to this life-saving message of Unitarian Universalism in the first place. We just need to remember, to notice each other's needs and seize the moment to act, to be willing to be uncomfortable in service to something greater than ourselves, to give of ourselves out of love and affection and compassion, to be truly kind to one another, to think before we speak, and speak with openness and generosity, to answer the call of our principles and our morals and our ethics and our faith. Let us be subject to one another. In our teal hymnal is the perfect affirmation of this message. The song we all know, written by Bill Withers. Rise, embody yourself.